Is this working? It's supposed to wait for me to tell. It seems to have started already without. It normally waits and asks me a few things to do first. This is confusing me. Ah, well. I wonder when it started. Hello, everyone. How are we all doing? How goes the world? Ba-da-da-dum. Apparently this started. Normally, I have to press a button in OBS and then press a button on the Stream Studio. Today it just started, so I'm not sure how that happened. Now, I'm going to preface today's one with... It's been a fun day. It has been a really fun day, and actually, speaking of the fun day, someone has just turned up at my front door, my door. Be back in a second. What do you want? Just literally gone live. Talking a second ago. Okay, that's up with it. So, here is something of reality. This is full of a lot of, how do I put this politely, best guesses. Because, well, rather like if someone had asked me 6 months ago to predict that when we have yet to even sign paperwork procuring a new house, and starting, we're going through all the initial stages, and it's all going through, but haven't gotten paperwork through. That the thing my sister will be using to distracting herself from my mum's medical appointments. Mum's okay, please note. Mum is okay. It's just it's being a nightmare trying to actually get her the right medical appointment because they keep sending to someone and then going, well, actually, you don't need to see me. You need to see someone with this specialism. Okay, fine. So we now need to do that and that and that. That my sister would be distracting herself. My wonderfully sane, fairly logical, cooking issued, but a very good engineer, exceptionally good engineer, sister would be worrying every 5 minutes about the paint choices for the property before we even bought it. I would not have believed anyone. So, therefore, this one, unlike most alternate histories, but unlike the others, is there isn't really as much to go on. It's an interesting thought experiment still to do. But whereas with most alternate histories, and if we've got, I think we've got one coming up about Soviet Union at Washington, Soviet Union at London Treaty. Well, then that gives us several waypoints. We've got the Washington Treaty already in place. We've got a lot of things already in place that we can fit it into, and we can go like let's look at Stalin's diplomacy style. Let's look at what Stalin might want, and let's go through the repercussions between the various nations, and you can work out that one. This one. A lot of the early 1920s takes place in a Russian vacuum because they're so busy sorting out themselves internally. And all sorts of interesting things happen in that period. Now, this means there's a problem because now you've got to insert Russia into those things. And that changes things quite dramatically. So, basically, this is going up to a certain point, but I'm not going a million miles. I'm not going to a Second World War because, honestly, I have a theory if Imperial Russia survives, whilst there is likely to be another World War, it might not wait till the 1940s, and it sure as hell might not be the same size as they were in World War II. And excuse the French there. So, yeah. It's going to be interesting. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Nautical Wolf. Hello, Michael Gooch. Hello, Mark Harkness. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Frank Bamwell. Hello, Jacob W5570. Hello, 96831. Hello, Mark Kalmagasberg. Hello, Mark Harkness. Hello, Byron Newman. Hello, DG40. Hello, Just Funk. Hello, Paul Amos. Hello, The Brock. Hello, Richard Gross. Hello, Leslie Mitchell. Hello, Tim O'Neill. My Valentine present of two 1200 scale waterline travel class destroyers has arrived. Very cool. Hello, Tim O'Neill. Hello, Deadlift Cruz. And hello, David Golding. Hello, everyone. So, this is going to be interesting. I'm also, I have to admit, going to do the obligatory social media posts. Because I should do the obligatory social media posts, because if I don't do the obligatory social media posts, then I'm being stupid at the moment, even though I absolutely hate most forms of social media. I quite like YouTube. You're all quite interesting to talk to, and you do tend to write incomplete sentences. This is going to sound something strange, but the amount of people who on other forms of social media just spout stupid and just go, that's wrong. Why do you think it's wrong? I can't really argue against you if you're just saying that's wrong, because I don't agree it's wrong. All I can say is right, and therefore we sound like a pair of 4-year-olds. And whilst I love hanging out with my 4-year-old little cousins and looking after them, they are not exactly who I esteem to sound like when I'm having a debate about a subject such as whether or not Britain should have had aircraft carriers, or whether or not saving them will suddenly make Ajax affordable. If you get rid of them, it won't, and frankly, Ajax is probably still a bit frickening and annoying. I don't know. I do love how some people are now some of the same people who, when I argued that we should be buying the US Marine Corps 8x8 APC rather than the otherwise lovely vehicle, the one we are buying, which is the sort of European one. And the reason I'd argue was because of its amphibious warfare capabilities. In fact, you could have the Royal Marines also go out, and therefore you could end up with three almost strike brigades formed around these vehicles and these APCs, and sort of one would be a Royal Marine amphibious strike brigade, but you have two army ones which could be used as amphibious brigades because they'd have the same vehicles. Those people are now arguing that the Royal Marines should buy that APC as a sole buy, and you sit there and go, no, you can't buy enough to justify buying that. If you were buying them as one group instead of buying Boxer, it makes sense. If you're buying them just for the Royal Marines, that's a very expensive buy, and it's going to make people think about cutting the Royal Marines. You know, hey ho. But that is Twitter, that is social media, and that is. Oof. The fun that is all that. How is everyone doing tonight? Does the Tsar survive? Well, if it's Imperial Russia, then it really can't be Imperial Russia if the Tsar doesn't survive, can it? That's the first thing. We're going to have to work out how they survive, because there are options. Which sounds strange to say, but there are options. Not necessarily the best options in the world, not really ones I would want to be taking, but, you know, if you're going to find yourself in that situation, there are options. They could work. Basically, it boils down to there is one option which could actually work. Literally one. It's not a good option. But it can work. The trouble is, though, with the star and the system surviving, as it did, and operating as it did historically, you then end up with the problem that you have the same idiots in charge. And I say this with all due respect, that they are due, because, well, just because I'm normally quite a polite person, they are idiots. I mean, I look at some of the people and some of the decisions they make in this time period, and I honestly wonder how they managed to stay in power for as long as they did, frigging did. I'm not saying that everyone else had a wonderful leadership, but they at least had a way of changing that leadership often enough that people didn't actually realise their leadership were idiots. And there you go. That is all the social media done. Now, before anyone asks, yes, my plan is to get a Steam Deck. It is to automate all that so I don't have to do it in future. That's on the list of things to do. So all the social media is taken care of, and I can just concentrate all on you. Won't we go live and just go beep, press button, and a series of macros function, and the world works. So. Knight6831, sometimes, honestly, comments don't require me to respond to them. And it's not something to get into on this video. Or discuss, but you... I know, so that's completely off topic. And, frankly, no. No. Okay? Hi, Miss ZZ. Hello, Stafford. Hello, Jack Ray. You recommend a large one, Jack Ray. I'm sure you do recommend a large one. How are you doing, Jack? Because I haven't seen you in a while. Or rather, you haven't been here as often. Just checking you're okay. I was about to send you a message at some point today. Nicholas II is living proof of the Theodore Roosevelt's adage. Best thing to do in the crisis is the right thing. Second best thing is the wrong thing. And worst thing to do is nothing. Yeah. So. When I was asked this question first, and it was coming towards me, I honestly thought... Hello, Mole's Revenge. I honestly thought... Well, that's interesting. But how do we do this? Because that's going to set the tone for everything. How we do this. Stafford, mums always come first. Family always comes first. Mums tend to always come first. Now, quickly skipping through, you should also find, hopefully, if I have set this up correctly, he says, if I have set this up correctly, there is always a chance I haven't, you should find a link to the competition for winning some copies of my video down below. If you can't, I am checking frantically now. And hopefully it's there. It should be. It is. It's in the description. It is in the description. Yay. Now, there is a competition for this. Thank you for your support. Basically, without you, the channel wouldn't be here. So thank you for everyone who likes, who shares, who subscribes, who does all that stuff. And thank you to everyone who comments and chats away. In light of the point 96831 made earlier, the reason I don't sometimes respond to comments on older videos is because, well, I always judge a comment by its relevance and whether I've answered it elsewhere and whether I can answer it. And that's the thing. I get back to the comments which I think I can answer. If they're a comment on an old video I've recorded a long time ago, and I'm looking at it and I'm going, well, I answered this in subsequent videos, I'll leave it at. Or if, in the case of 96831, as he brought this up, I'm going to mention this one. If I remember correctly, one the other day you were talking about was your belief is different from about how the British Empire would react to America and be obsessed about the numbers of battleships versus their newness and quality and accumulative tonnage. That's a judgment call. And especially when you're looking at alternate history. And seeing as I don't agree with that, the only answer I would come up with would be me going, well, I don't agree because of this, and you go, well, I think it this way, this, and there's honestly no point in having that discussion. There's no point. We'll just waste my time and your time. And at the moment, I'm in the middle of organising moving a house, so no. Sorry. No. If I have nothing else pressing on my time, I will happily respond to all the inane comments. And even the ones which I know will end up with literally just a bit us just going, well, it's agree to disagree is the honest answer. But if I am very busy, then I don't. I'm sorry if that upsets you, but I'm not sorry enough to change my habits because I only have 24 hours in a day. So, getting to this one. How can Imperial Russia survive? Well, there are three real options. The Archangel Railway actually works. Unfortunately, getting into Archangel in winter is interesting to near on impossible. And with the stuff they have going around this period, and getting enough supplies through there to go down the railway to help, it's not like World War II. And you have to remember, in World War II, a lot of the supplies to Russia do not go for the Arctic convoy routes. They go for Iran, or Persia, as it was at the time. Some of them even come in from the Far East. So, yeah, that's an interesting idea. It's an option, it's one of the options, but it's not going to save Russia. Okay, Royal Navy wins Jutland completely, forces the Baltic. This does probably end the war probably in 1916. It could forestall the revolution in 1917. But the thing is, it's probably not. Considering the revolution happens in February 1917, it would be a jolly close run thing, and whether or not enough supplies would get through in time is a completely different matter. So, what's next? Well, next one is actually another alternate history we've discussed quite a lot over the time, and we have mentioned that Russia could survive under those circumstances, and that is Gallipoli is actually carried out sensibly. The fleet doesn't try to go alone. It uses the time spent gathering the troops to convert some sort of Royal Sovereign style battleships, aka pre-dreadnoughts as they're more traditionally called, but I don't like calling them that, as you all know, into cork-filled minesweepers to charge the minefield in front of them. Don't do an attack and warn the Ottomans that they're coming, and thus seize the Dardanelles and allow for a constant resupply of Russia through Crimea and the ports in the southwest of Russia, southwest of Russian territory at this time. Those are the options. Those are the realistic options. It's a useful scenario. It's pretty much the only last one is the only scenario I can see, and I'm now prepared, quite happy to open the floor to everyone in the chat to go, do you think of any other scenarios short of aliens invading? And short of you having to go back and do massive structural reform in Russia post the Russo-Japanese War to change their entire military and infrastructural makeup, and probably prior to the Russo-Japanese War to actually give it time. Because let's be honest, the Russo-Japanese War ends less than a decade before this war begins. And Russia is in not a fit state for World War One, let alone was it in a fit state for the Russo-Japanese War. So arguably you have to go back to somewhere in the 1880s and start building Russian infrastructure from the get-go. Even the Ottomans not joining the Central Powers, and that's a nice one to insert, are still going to cause you problems, because the Ottoman strategic interest does not preclude precludes a strong Russia. I know that one can be an obvious one, but Ottomans were never neutral when it was concerned with Russia, because Russia was their major strategic threat. Which is the power which is constantly threatening to invade the Dardanelles, which they built most of their defences. One of the reasons why the Dardanelles are so weak on one side versus the other is because of the strength of the Russians, and the Russians constantly trying to invade. The Russians have been after Constantinople, Istanbul for a very, very long time. They would claim it's to do with the Russian Orthodox Church and uniting the Orthodox Church and protecting its holy territories for much of that period. But let's be honest, the realistic one is warm water ports and control of access to the Black Sea. Even the USA joining World War I earlier doesn't save Russia. You can only save Russia if you can get supplies to it. You know, even while America joins World War I at the beginning of World War I, joins World War I in 1914. Well, hey, lovely. But A, you have to change up a lot of American politics to get that. And B, you then, once you have America there, how are they going to get supply? How are supplies going to get through to Russia? It took America pretty much 18 months to go from joining the war to actually being fully worked up into the war. So they would still be there by 1916. And let's be honest, what are their extra forces going to do? How do they help in terms of Russia? How do they get there? It doesn't really help. It's got to be the first Dardanelles, and it's going to be a simple, quick campaign. You've got to do it properly. You've got to do it instead of the first to strike on Dardanelles where you try to force it with ships alone. You've got to go in for the first Dardanelles straight off, with ships, with troops, everything actually properly organised. Again, Michael Couch, alternate scenario. Lenin not put in train by Germans. A red assassination of Tsar shocks country. His son becomes Tsar and a competent regent. A, you've got to find a competent regent. B, you've got to make the country the Tsar actually popular in the country. The Tsar is not that popular. And even killing him might not change that. And C, Lenin not being put on the train by the Germans, that was their entire motif. They're doing that. Oh no, honestly, the only scenario you can do is if you can try and deaden the fertile soil. So if they're actually looked to be winning the war, and this is the one reason why Dardanelles is important, because if you actually win something, and you link up with supplies, and Russia's got supplies coming in, and they've got food coming in, they've got all the supports coming in they need, and they can export raw materials as well and earn money for their economy as well, then you've got actually a chance of keeping the economy going, of keeping the country going, of actually staving off things. It's been decades since my systematic study of Russian history. What I recall was the reaction to the assassination of Alexander II did more to set up the conditions of 1917 than almost everything short of World War I. Yeah. Ottomans join the Entente. Again, that's an interesting idea and could theoretically work, but the trouble is, the Ottomans, that means you have to change the entire Ottoman leadership. And again, that's quite a big change to push through. If you're working with actual historical events that happened and just shifting them away, a competent Dardanelles is actually more likely than completely changing the leadership of America or the Ottoman Empire. Jackery, if the Tsar had an idea and put in Republican democratic reforms, here's Russia. It's got worse. It gets worse a lot. It gets worse a lot. So that's the reality. Goes fourth option. Hungary's two mobilization plans didn't get mixed up. Bulgaria enters the side of Central Powers, so Brest-Litovsk peace happens in 1916 and Germans didn't send Lenin. No. In a nicer way, you're changing history dramatically at that point. You're almost trying to make it like war didn't happen. And also, I don't think even if Austro-Hungary's mobilization plans actually work out, that you actually change history. I just think they were all too... Everyone had too many blinders on. Let's be honest, the British send an expeditionary force to France. And that's probably one of the most stupid things Britain could do. And this is not denigrating the people who died or in any way, shape or form, but the thing was, Britain didn't have a massive land army, we had a massive navy. We contributed naval power to the Entente. The fact that our army proved so crucial just actually shows how bad a state our supposed continental power allies who were supposed to be providing the armies were in. You know. Bulgaria did enter on the side of Central Powers because it had beef with Romania. Yet you realise very quickly once you look through World War I that most of the people are setting very petty feuds between individual nations, and they're sort of joining part in a major fight. So let's see. So if the February Revolution fails, and please note that's the thing. The request was if the February Revolution fails. So the other criteria I used was the February Revolution still has to happen. And whatever's changed, it's changed enough so that the February Revolution fails. And the idea is if you've got constant supplies coming in, if your armed forces are constantly being fed and you've got money to pay them and ammunition to give them, then any revolution which happens, your military hopefully stays loyal. And let's be honest, if the military had stayed loyal and had proved reliable, as they traditionally had proved in these scenarios, it could have been very nasty for the revolutionaries. Because one of the things you realise is that there's a lot of groups who did not like the revolution. And you only need a larger proportion of the army to stay loyal and carry on fighting, and those groups could have won. There is a reason the white forces last so long fighting against the Reds in the Civil War. There is a reason an admiral manages to march most of his sailors and pretty much all the soldiers from the Far East across most of Russia, most of the Russian Empire, across that along the railway line, and pretty much almost gets to Moscow. He's about a battle or so away from Moscow when eventually his forces actually fall apart. And it's that's there is a lot of capability there. They just need something more. There's also a factor that you have to let this happen, and this will happen. You've still got the same leadership. And maybe the February Revolution actually gets some better leadership involved, but let's consider this particular rogues gallery. These are the people who surrounded the Tsar when he signed his abdication. None of them are luminaries, okay? None of them are people you necessarily want in the powerful positions they are. Because the problem with the Russian Tsarist system is, especially amongst the senior aristocracy who run it and who are involved in it, they spend more time fighting for small promotions in court than they do paying attention to the world outside them, outside of court, let alone the world outside of Russia. And that's a problem. Like I said, Magmans, even if you imagine a Tsar who proposes democratic reforms, there's so few people in Russia's power structure who would tolerate it to make it possible. Yeah. There have been times Tsars have moved towards actually breaking the power of the nobility. And let's be honest, the joke with Britain was the reason Britain gained the parliament and the power it did, especially post the Glorious Revolution, was because the monarchy wanted to balance the power of the nobility by giving the middle classes, the professional classes, whatever you call them, the merchant classes, a voice, aka the House of Commons. That was on par with the House of Lords. You set up a counterbalance to the nobles. The Russian aristocracy had spotted this. There is a reason there is anti-democratic reforms as they are. Not because they're ardent supporters of the Tsar, no. Because their power to influence the Tsar and therefore influence Russian policy in their favour would be severely curtailed should there be a competing power bloc. This is basically Russia's problem. Trendelenko, I'm sorry, when you start going in about the Austro-Hungarian deficient artillery industrial base, A, Calvin Gasberg is probably currently preparing the world's longest series of comments and response, and B, Skoda is just one of several major manufacturers who exist in Austria. Honestly, Austria had... The problem they had was more a surfeit of too good at artillery to pick from, which meant they didn't pick enough of it. They kept going, oh, but we've got this new one which is really good, and that new one which is really good, which meant they never ordered enough of the one they needed to standardize on it. So it's not so much their industrial base is the problem, or deficient artillery, it's their attention span. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Back with Maximus. It is gonna be interesting. The February Revolution fails. The February Revolution fails. Yeah, da, da, ding, ding, ding. Now, I will say, one of the problems I've found with the maps is finding a decent map which is not licensed, which I don't have to pay an arm and leg for. And I have to say, what I have done is borrow a map. We've got that coming up. We have that coming up. So, before we get into a full discussion of the Treaty of Versailles, it's worthwhile considering what are going to be the differences of having Russia there. They are going to be a hardline voice. What is Russia's needs going to be from a naval term? They're going to be aiming for modern cruisers. They might want some of the battleships, but they're really going to be aiming for the modern cruisers, which is going to be a problem for pretty much everyone. And so Nuremberg, Emden, and Frankfurt are going to be their absolute top priorities in terms of what they want. But the Treaty of Versailles is going to be very, very different. Now, if I can get image free to come up, yay, it is. And the image free, by the way, is borrowed from the BBC teaching website. Oh, caramba. So, here is the reality. If you consider some of these countries... No, I want to move that. Pre-1914, you see a German Empire, which is quite large. You see the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you see the Russian Empire. Post-1914, in our world, and post-1923, in our world, you have Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. You have Finland that's gone independent. That's another one that's not included here. Poland. Romania has grown greatly in size. Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. All these things have happened. Okay? Well, you're unlikely to get the breaking up of the Russian Empire. In fact, honestly, Russia's going to want territory. Russia is going to want territory. France is getting Alsace-Lorraine. I wouldn't be surprised if Russia wants everything up to Danzig. They're going to want industry. They're going to want infrastructure. They're going to want everything they can get their hands on. I would also not be surprised if Russia pushes for a greater breakup of Germany. You see how Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up? I wouldn't be surprised if Russia joins with France in the idea of pushing for Germany to broken up even more. You have to remember that there was quite a large idea within France at this time, which was shot down by Britain and America, for breaking up Germany into its principalities, i.e. sending it back to It's pre-Bismarck state. Now, this is where you get into issues, okay? Because you're going to have a big problem with all this. Britain and America are not going to be necessarily keen on it. You could end up seeing coming out of... You could almost see coming out of Versailles a dividing of the world between Britain and America and France and Russia. That sounds strange to say with the history we've had, but think about it. The Franco-Russian alliance is the traditional alliance. They'd be backing each other up at this conference. The British and the Americans are the moderates. They'd be the ones being there actually antagonizing and arguing against them. That is literally what could happen. You also have to remember the big reason why there was the Anglo-Japanese alliance was to deal with the Franco-Russian strength. So if Russia is getting more territory, more industry, and is getting, more importantly, more ships, yes, they are broke, but Japan is not going to be very happy about it. Japan's going to be worried about it. Now, the reality is, I don't think Poland ends up existing in this scenario. And that feels wrong to say, but I don't think Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia end up existing. I don't know if Poland ends up existing. Not by the Treaty of Versailles. And please note, I'm saying this not by the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this is going to be complicated. Again, if the German fleet sinks itself in Scapa Flow, again, as historically happened, that is going to save a lot of issues. Because whilst we often talk about the dreadnoughts which go around, the battle cruisers, the battleships which sink, there's also quite a lot of cruisers which go down in Scapa Flow, okay? Including many of the most modern German cruisers go down in Scapa Flow. If those survive, you have a problem coming. It's going to change the calculation of a lot of powers. For example, if you've got a larger Imperial Russia, does Italy necessarily want more of Austro-Hungarian territory so that it has a stronger buffer zone in its north? Does it want more of the mountainous Alpine region? Let's be honest, you're going to have issues here because you're also going to have an Ottoman Empire which is broken up as well. So an Ottoman Empire which has been broken up, smashed up by that operation, has turned into Turkey. What's going to happen to the Constantinople and Dardanelles? Are the Russians going to demand that as a war prize? Are they going to demand the right to base a garrison there? Which has been their dream for nearly 100 years at this point. The thing is, we really don't know, but honestly, they're probably going to come out trying to demand it all. They won't likely get it. Mainly because I have a feeling the garrison that's going to be there is going to be British Anglo-Greek. It will be an Anglo-Greek garrison which is going to be there, and the British won't hand it over to the Russians. The British will either make sure they evacuate well before the Russians arrive so that the Turks can swarm in, or give it to the Greeks. And then agree an alliance with Greece. So that if the Russians do try and take it, they know the Brits will come in. But, yes, Black Max, you are right. For the Russians, getting Constantinople, getting Russian troops at the Hagia Sophia would be a massive win, which would help secure the Tsar's power. It would give him absolute influence over the church. Hello, Wayne Niles. Hello, New Zealand. It's the Treaty of Versailles. You cannot overstate how much different it's going to be. You also cannot overstate the effect it's probably going to have on the German position. Because at best, what survives of Germany is going to be very different. They're not going to have this little bit over here. They're not going to get to keep that bit in north of Poland that they had historically kept sort of above Poland. Poland is going to be part of Russia, and I think probably the Germans are going to be pushed back into a straight line somewhere in that area, as far back as the Russians can get away with. But I have a feeling Germany is broken up. And Germany, collectively, all the states get limited in terms of what ships they can have. Hello, Dark Lord Ajax. I honestly cannot see a scenario where Russia and France, who will be as hardline as you can possibly imagine on this negotiations, will settle for anything less than the complete dismemberment of Germany. Black Maximus, international city, Greece, Bulgaria, Russia, Britain, Russians have districts in Constantinople. Could be made an international city. There are options. I wouldn't be surprised under that scenario if the British don't suggest the Japanese Japanese and Americans get a section as well. And there's a reason for that. There is no one more diametrically opposed to the Russians than the Japanese. And for the British, therefore, it's useful to have them along. But realistically, you are going to be dealing with issues. I think Wilson's 14 points fall on even deafer ears than they have before, but I think that it goes further. Post-war world, just because they win the February Revolution doesn't mean that they've solved the problems. Okay? Doesn't mean that those issues are dealt with. Nice one. Is that worth annoying the two people who basically own a lot of, if not all, of France's debts, which are the British Empire and the United States? 9631, there are few countries more strategically strategically obtuse than France in the 1920s and 30s. We're talking about a nation which we all know they don't give decent radios to their army. They do all sorts of things to strip their own armed forces of their capability to fight, and then are surprised when they can't actually react to what the enemy do. I honestly, France and Russia are going to consider themselves the winners of this war. doesn't matter again. It's kind of like any points of history. They are going to write a narrative where it was the Great French Defense. The Great French Defense which sucked the Germans of their strength, and the glorious Russian armies which stormed in from the east. And yeah, it might actually, if you do manage to keep the Russian armies going, it might shorten the war, because the Germans never have enough forces, are never going to be able to remember, you have to remember, towards the end of the war, once they're able to get peace on the eastern frontier, they send them all to the west, and that's the last big offensives for Germany in Europe in World War One are all thanks to the troops they bring from the eastern frontier. They're not going to get to do that. So it's going to change the course of the war. It's going to change those last offensives. It's probably going to make the war end slightly earlier than it did historically. And I wouldn't be surprised if France and Russia both write a version of history, which, in this scenario, which greatly elaborates on their involvement and their cruciality to it. So, wouldn't the UK use the US and Japan to try and limit Russian expansion? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if the British do. I wouldn't be surprised. But the fact is, there's a limit to what you can actually do. If you think about this, this is all done not by the Treaty of Versailles. This has been the treaty between Russia and Germany, the end of the war between them and Germany. And, you know, that's what forced the Russian border back, not the Treaty of Versailles. Question: if the war ends before 1970, how much influence does the US and Wilson actually have? Well, that's the other problem. The actual influence of the Americans is going to be a lot more limited the shorter the war was with their involvement, and the more diluted their involvement is vis-a-vis the rest of the forces involved. And likelihood, as certain critics pointed out, the Bosporus, they wanted the Bosporus for a long, long time. It would be an interesting scenario. As for the League of Nations, well, that comes another fun thing. That is another fun thing. But what I want to talk about also is Finland, because I have a very strong suspicion that the Russification of Finland will probably be taken up again, even more strongly if they win. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see a war break out in Finland. I would also not be surprised if in the early 1920s you see wars break out in quite a lot of these countries. Because as strong as Russia will look to messing outsiders because of their size, the fact is they're going to get a lot of territories which want independence, which don't want to be part of Russia, which are their own nations, which want to be themselves. And the thing is, whereas there are ways you can deal with that, you can actually diffuse that kind of scenario. The Russian government is not going to. They're going to try and crack down. They're going to send in the secret police. They're going to send in the soldiers. And that's going to cause them problems. I think when it comes to the Dardanelles, the British will want to keep the Dardanelles in an independent powers. I think what they might do is they might, how do I put this, give give the northern shore and that area to Greece. I think that's what you might see. You might see that area given to Greece, and Turkey given the southern side, and pretty much then them charged to run it jointly with a joint authority. And then the Russians can't really complain, because the British will go, well, you know, it has been given to a Orthodox church, an Orthodox state. It's just we've gone with the Greek Orthodox state rather than the Russian Orthodox state, because we feel the Greeks were closer. And the advantage for them with that would be if Greek soldiers were involved in the operations. So if Greek soldiers have been involved in the operations and actually taken it, whereas the Russian soldiers haven't, they will give it to the Greeks, and their excuse will be, well, the Greeks won it. And the Russians, at that point, whilst the Russians will want it, their casus belli for charging for it, which they often use, is that it's the great Orthodox Christian centre point, and it's under control of a different faith. Well, if it's under control of the Greeks, that argument disappears a bit. So expect it to be complicated. It also then will helpfully cause a point of tension between the two Orthodox powers, which means the Greeks will be even more friendly with the Brits, which will serve the Brits' needs, and probably cause issues elsewhere. There's if war erupted in Finland, it'll probably erupt in Poland and Ukraine, and Britain wanting to contain Russian expansion could offer material for support of efforts. Britain would do no such thing. Britain would not get involved in them. What it would do is manage to make sure that certain materials fall into their hands. But at no point would the British government announce they are sending aid to Ukraine or to Finland or to Poland at this time period. It just isn't going to happen. Today, you do that. Especially if you're a major power. This period, you don't. You set up, you know, just a good example is the Spanish Civil War, where there are volunteer brigades, international brigades, all sorts of things around that. It was a good way of getting around. The sheer number of people who ended up in those brigades who then had suspiciously senior equivalent ranks in the British Army at the beginning of World War II. It's amazing. But, you know, things happened. No, Darius, but I needed to clarify your point. If you're going to, when you talk about it, you need to clarify it, because otherwise people will get involved and start doing all sorts of weird things. Denmark gets up to the Kiel Canal. Again, that's an interesting one. If you are going to break up Germany properly, they could do. In fact, if you're going to break up Germany properly, you might actually give the Danish the Kiel Canal. As it's a defensible position for them. So now we have the League of Nations. Now, Russia would probably join us in 1920 with France. Not 1934, if it comes about. And it still could come about because it's an interesting idea and there's enough support in different nations. But the thing is, America famously supports the creation of League of Nations and then doesn't join. In a world where Russia, an active Imperial Russia, is a member, suddenly America is isolationist, but they're not isolationist to the point of stupidity. I could see them ending up joining the League of Nations purely from the point of view of wanting to keep an eye on the Russians and to stop the League of Nations maybe being used to sanctify some of the Russian positions. Again, they're not too keen on the British occasionally, but honestly, out of that group, they probably prefer the British over the rest. So it becomes a very interesting scenario. Very quickly it becomes a very, very interesting scenario. And a very complicated one. Because the League of Nations, if you've got no Germany, and I would say even if a state called Germany still exists, it's going to be far smaller than it is in this map. In this map, it's not going to be that big if Russia's involved. Because Russia really, really wants a big win. You have to remember, for Russia, they lost the Russo-Japanese War. They've lost a couple of wars on a trot. They have had issues. They've been frustrated in pretty much all their expansion plans. If they need a win, and they need a big win. Russia is the definition of the used car salesman who used to think they were the biggest, baddest salesman in town and are now about 3 months behind on their mortgage payments, 2 months behind on all the rest of their bills, and their wife is increasingly looking at the next door neighbor who's a milkman. That they are literally just in there going, everything's falling apart. And they need a win. They need a win. Hello, Dan. So, I think an early 1920s war is likely. I think, as said, I'm sure you have a war in Finland. The interesting thing will be whether or not the Swedes and the Norwegians get involved. I think even if you don't have, even before internal war breaks out, I think the Russians might try an external war. Which is going to be interesting if they're a member of the League of Nations. So who do they focus on? China's a member of the League, Japan's a member of the League. You know, you start looking around of who are they going to pick on, which is not a League of Nations member. Interesting enough, the option could be Sweden. They could decide to go for Sweden. Again, there's been Russo-Swedish wars before, and the Russians gaining complete control of the Baltic and turning into a Russian sea is a possibility, but there's also Romania. Quite a big territory at this point. They could well try to go for it. They could be fighting internal wars. I am absolutely certain Finland is going to come up, and I agree, Poland and potentially Ukraine. Ukraine is more interesting. Ukraine pre the purge of the Cossacks is slightly more different, and it depends again how powerful the Cossacks are in this post-World War One Russia, because again, which factions have put down basically the revolution in February. If the Cossacks and the Ukrainian force personnel were a major factor in putting down the February Revolution, and in providing forces for the wider war effort in World War One, you could well find that enough of their powerful voices are satisfied with their increasingly powerful position within Russia, and they're happy with it. Now, Persia, or Iran as we call it today, could well be a target they could go for as a foreign one, which of course is a gateway to India, and the British aren't going to be keen on that. Afghanistan, they could go for there. There are lots of potential territories they could try working their way down. I don't think Siberia tries for independence, but I think, again, a war against the Japanese, I'm not sure they go for that this soon. The Japanese have a lot of firepower and a lot of capability, and the Russians might exercise slightly more sense. Going for some of the former Ottoman territories, again, could be a thing they do. The reality is, warm water support is going to be important to them. But, to an extent, they've now got Danzig and all the territory after it. So, they've got Danzig, and that's quite a good port. And Persian campaign, yes. But the trouble is, the Shah of Persia is a good friend of the British. This is the one thing why I don't think they necessarily go for Persia. Because even the communists agreed that Iran decided they weren't going to fight with the British over Persia. They knew the British were prepared to send a lot of troops and do a lot of work to maintain their influence in Persia. There is a reason why Persia is basically divided into two spheres of influence, and the British have the coastal side at the south, and the Russians get the north of it. It's complicated, but they could well try and push for it. They could well try and push it, but I'm fairly sure they will have internal wars, and they will probably have an external war in the early 1920s. Because again, this is going to be Russia, but they're going to be feeling cocky. They'll feel they've just won a major war. The problem here, of course, becomes, does France get involved in it? France is going to be in no condition really to get involved in it after World War One. And you would maybe think that Russia doesn't want to get involved in it after World War One, but let's be honest, Russia, their reaction to wars is not the same in this period as perhaps they should be. The Russian Empire is fairly vast at this point, Cody. Fairly vast. There is always the possibility they decide they want to go for try and get Alaska back. Or they try and go for Canada, but I doubt that. I think, as said, it's difficult to work out. It's going to depend on a lot of relationships. It's going to depend a lot of negotiations. It's also going to depend on exactly what this particular bunch of interesting individuals cooks up between them. I mean, they are going to be fun. They really are. They are a group which is Like honest, but Russia is a rewrite of history. France owes them for beating Germany while France was defending. Yeah, there is going to be some of that. There is going to be a lot of very interesting statements made, and it's going to cause issues. Without a doubt, it will cause issues. Freudian slip there. Potentially. The trouble is, then this brings us to the Washington Naval Treaty. And this is roughly as far as we're going to get. We're going to talk through the Washington Naval Treaty and its consequences, because honestly, when you have an Imperial Russia, with their propensity, let's put it this way, Communist Russia has a propensity for internal massive reform and trying to push themselves forward. In that way, they're almost more predictable, and they spend so much time to concentrate internally, they don't really do external stuff. Whereas Imperial Russia is absurd. You have an Anglo-Japanese alliance was originally predicated, as said, on the anti-Franco-Russian alliance. The entire reason for the alliance was to stop the Russians being able to attack British territories in the Far East if the British were fighting war with France. And to stop the Japanese having to face the combined might of the Russian and French fleets. And remember, France doesn't even support the Russian fleet. Think about that. The French actually have bases in Southeast Asia that the Russian fleet could have reformed itself at, could have reorganized itself at. They don't. Why? Because the British have turned around to the French and gone, you help them. We've got a treaty with the Japanese. We will get involved. And the French are going, we don't want that. Journey UK. Going for Alaska might be an option, considering Putin's claim that the sale to the US was illegal. I can't be a new attitude, nor I suspect one unique to him. It's a fairly new attitude, because trust me, my point of this view is that that's the one which is a post-communist attitude. You have to remember, this would be a continuation of the imperial government, the ones who carried out the sale. So for them to try and say the sale was illegal is kind of difficult as long as Tsar Nicholas is still alive. Maybe his successor or his successor's successor can claim there was something underhand going on. But unless you want to try and say that the Tsar is fallible in the Tsarist regime, you can't really rewrite that particular piece of history under Tsarist rule. If Germany's broken up, honestly, Blackman Maximus, the thing is, the rebellions are going to be very different if there are rebellions. If Germany is broken up into the principalities and the small states of the pre-Bismarckian era, you have a very different Germany, different scenario to deal with. So, I would also argue that calculations for the treaty change in terms of America's calculations for the treaties. Because remember, America's calculations for the treaties are America and Britain rule the world. That's not necessarily going to wash in any treaty involving Imperial Russia. They won't want to admit that. It's true. And the thing is, also, at that point, France, are they going to be a weaker naval power than Russia? Or is Russia, you know, this is going to be a very, very complicated treaty to get through. It's going to take a long time to work through. Well, let's see. Russia got its back broken when they lost the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Yeah, pretty much they do. They do suffer, and they are trying some reforms to their military part after that, but things become an issue. So here is the thing for you all to think about on this one, and this one I'm going to really want you all to get involved in. So, as written, Article 4, Article 7 allocate tonnages to the powers in the Washington Naval Treaty. Where does Russia want to be on that list? Where does Russia want to be on that list? And let's be honest, Britain and America might accept in terms of treaty equality with America. They're not going to accept equality with Russia. And America will is going to be happy with equality of Britain. They're not going to want equality of Russia. That's not going to be a factor in their equations. There is no way either of them are going to accept Russia being a number one with them. Is Japan going to accept being weaker than Russia? Is Russia going to accept being weaker than Japan? Is France and Italy going to accept? Let's be honest. The one who really doesn't care in most of this argument is going to be Italy. They are completely going to win this one again, because they're just going to demand equality for whatever the French position is. But you add Imperial Russia to this conference. Think about it. You know, will America accept equality with Japan? Will they? Oh, it is. And even France and Russia, even if they're allied, will France accept being weaker than Russia? As Martin says, Russia is a land power, but Russia will still look towards an eventual rematch, so they have to equal Japan. I agree. All I can really tell you is that whatever the Washington Treaty that is eventually agreed, it's going to look nothing like this. It's going to look absolutely nothing like this. I don't know how they end up working out the levels. Now, they could keep the Anglo-British, Anglo-Japanese alliance going. There could be, as part of it, could be an alliance that each power agrees to guarantee the security of the other powers, and should any one of them attack another, all the others are honor bound to join the side of the one who's been attacked. And that could allow the Japanese to accept parity with the Russians. If they know that if they have parity with the Russians, it doesn't matter, because if the Russians declare war on them, then whilst France might declare neutrality and Italy might not be go, well, we can barely get involved, the British and the Americans are both going to come in and help beat up the Russians under the treaty terms. But there again, is France going to accept anything less than Russia? And is Italy's not going to accept anything less than France? So you could end up with Japan, France, Italy, and Russia all having 315,000 tons and 81,000 tons. And then will Britain and America really accept only having that tonnage? In which case does Japan accept having tonnage? The whole thing is going to be an absolute nightmare. Russia is a major land power, yes, but Russia is not going to accept being in any way, shape, or form weaker than it wants to be. And yes, there is a possibility of the treaty breaking up. I was lucky. Japan would actually withdraw from the treaty and Russia taking Japan's place. Well, the trouble is, if Japan withdraws from the treaty, remember, they're one of the major people constructing dreadnoughts. Let's be honest. No one gives a flying hoot about the dreadnoughts the Russians are constructing at this point. The Ganguts are good compared to the rest of them. And I know I've talked about their battlecruisers, etc., but honestly, the Russian dreadnoughts, they don't care. The British and Americans don't care about the Russians being involved in this treaty to the extent they care about the Japanese. Because if the Japanese aren't restricted by treaty, then Britain and America aren't going to be restricted by treaty. So if the Japanese withdraw because of the Russians, then the treaty's going to collapse. Adrian, the thing is if the battles late 1917 1918 don't, passion is partly because of Russia out of war. And Britain has more money and has lost less men. It can afford a bigger Royal Navy. It could afford a bigger Royal Navy anyway than it did historically have post-World War One and in the interwar years, but that's neither here nor there. This is going to be politics. Lord Ajax, they will also probably be viewing France as a threat, as France and Russia are probably competing for influence in the German principalities. Exactly. So Britain, but true, but also they're going to be their frenemies. The thing is, will Russia be able to build to their limit? How big it will be? True, but they could then procure from abroad. And let's be honest, if we go back to this one, they have just acquired some of those German some of those German yards. Think about it. If they've acquired, and I'm don't want to move that around. Why is that moving around? You lock things in position and they still move. I want to move that. I want to move that slide. That slide. Thank you. So if the Russians have control of up to here, they get a good few German yards. Think about that. They get all this coastline. They get Danzig. They get all those facilities. Steve Clarke, the only negotiation I have read about Russia is the Conference of Vienna, and the Tsar was pain in the posterior. Exactly. Mostly because he keeps flip-flopping and changing his position, trying to seek glory, or trying to be following whoever's flattered him last. He was a popinjay of the First Order. I think the exact thing is, does the treaty ever happen, is probably the right route to go down. Honestly, the more I look into it, the more I think, does the treaty happen? And whilst Runon is right, Russia can claim their vested interest in trade protection in both oceans. both the Atlantic and the Pacific, versus Japan just Pacific. They also had the Black Sea. Russia claims they need 4 fleets. They claim they need a Baltic fleet, a North Sea fleet, a Black Sea fleet, and a Pacific fleet. And because they're all so geographically separated, they need 4 complete fleets. Alzowski, those German yards in Russia requires they would be stripped down and sent to Russia, where they would realise no one knows how to use the machines. Britain would have hands on that. Well, remember, this is new Russian territory now, so Alzowski, they don't need to move them to be in Russian territory. They've taken over that territory. It's part of Russia. So you're basically saying you're moving them from one part of Russia where they don't know, where they know how to use them, to another part of Russia where they don't. And yes, if France is parity to Russia, a Franco-Russia alliance can counterbalance that, especially if France gives Russia basing rights in the Mediterranean. Yeah. Which means France is no longer as dependent upon Britain as it was historically. And they may add an Arctic fleet. They may add an Arctic fleet, although the likelihood of them actually being able to operate an Arctic fleet is interesting. In which, yeah, it's all of it's going to be an interesting scenario. Myself, I don't think. I think they try for a Washington Treaty. My strong suspicion is it would collapse. My strong suspicion is it would collapse. And my strong suspicion is that Russia would continue to have issues with what they're constructing. And yeah, Britain could end up making good friends with Il Duce. Volcano. If they can't work out agreeable tonnage figures, then it might just be an early London Treaty with a freeze on future capital ship construction, with each nation completing what they're building. Well, that's not really what the London Treaty agrees, although I can see where you're sort of going with that one. But I think you'd be more looking at maybe some sort of London Treaty along the lines of the 1936 rather than 1930 London Treaty, where they agree limitations on the size of ships. So they agree there's an upper limit of gun size, an upper limit of ship size, etc. But I honestly don't think you get for such things. Because again, what Russia and France are going to want versus what Britain and America are going to want versus what Japan and Italy are going to want are going to be so different they're going to keep disagreeing. Alzowski, running a shipyard in de facto occupied territory. That won't work. Even if you call it Russia, you could have to expel the local population to avoid sabotage. There's word limit in the... There's a word limit in the chat? Sorry, I've forgotten that. Don't worry, Funkana. Yeah, I thought when you said it, you were talking about the 1930 London Treaty, and then I thought, well, maybe it's the 1936 one, so that's why I did the answer I did. Running shipyard. Alzowski, again, you're exercising a larger modicum of thought than I believe the Russian leadership is capable of. So I think they will try, and they will believe it is part of Russia. Because you have to remember the Russians believe in Russification. So they will expand their Russification attempts to Poland, to this parts of Germany, to all the territory they have. The same Russification they've been trying to do in Finland, they will try to do everywhere else. Does Italy even go fascist in this timeline? More than likely. When I say they go fascist, though, I think you might be dealing with a very different political party, because it's unlikely you're going to have the communists have the same level of power and threat as they did historically. So I think you might see a fascisti party which is slightly different in its timbre. I was actually also, yeah, some governor would get a bright idea of moving Russia's population to Siberia. Oh, I agree. There's all going to be all sorts of things, and you are very right. I just don't think they're smart enough to think it through. I think, honestly, so I can see a massive depopulation of new German territories to escape Russification. Yep. Or a massive civil war to escape Russification. Because again, think about it. Think about all those new people in that area. There are going to be quite a lot of them who are soldiers who've been fighting in World War One in the German army. They're quite capable. They're probably just as capable, and just they can fairly quickly organize. Do you really want to end up fighting a war against them in their own homeland? Sam Penguins, does this mean that the USA avoids the Red Summer and the various race riots in the 1920s? They might involve some of the stuff about scares of communism, because communism, and that could affect all the major powers in the world, could be less worried about communism because communism and socialist revolutions failed in Russia. It could also take a lot of the, how do I put this, energy out of the global sort of socialist communist movement at this time. But I think you could also find yourself dealing with other issues. So I'm not sure about the race riots. And I think you might well get mass ethnic German population, movement of German populations probably to South America and the Americas, getting away from the Russification program post-World War I. It's honestly, it's a mess. But as I said, my strong suspicion is you start negotiating a Washington Naval Treaty, I don't think you get one. And I think that's the problem. Because whilst you might get something which is an agreement on tonnages and sizes, there's also going to be how long is it going to take. And what ships are going to be in service by the time it's finished. Because let's say the G3s are all ordered in October 1921. Okay? They are traditionally suspended in November 1921. The thing is, Armistice Day won't be on the 11th of November, because I think it'll be different in this scenario, for obvious reasons, because I think it'll end in a different month. I think it'll end slightly sooner in 1918, but also, I don't think they will suspend the construction of them. I don't think they'll be cancelled in February 1922. Because I think the treaty, any treaty that they do end up agreeing, is probably going to take years to negotiate. And I think the British are going to keep building the G3s while they're doing it. And maybe even start the N3s. There is a real scenario in my head where both the G3s and the N3s actually get completed before any treaty goes through. And so the tonnage limitations and size limitations on the ships are 50,000 tons in standard and 18-inch guns. And that could well be the limitation they accept. Oh, you cannot build a battleship larger than 50,000 tons and 18-inch guns. Aircraft carriers, who knows? Who knows what happens in that scenario? as said, my view is, if a treaty does happen, I do agree with the people who suggested maybe London-style treaty, but I think the idea is it would be a 1936-style London treaty, where you have limitations on how big ships can be and how big their main guns can be, not limitations on how many you can build. You can build as many as you like. Because that's how Britain and America will preserve their edge. And that is also going to have an impact on the economics, because Britain and America are going to be building ships, which is going to have an impact on the Great Recession, all these other things, because there are going to be ongoing shipbuilding programs, which they're going to keep going on. Now, Michael Coaches has pointed out the Irish Civil War could be bloodier and harder fought. It could be. It could be. I think that's unlikely. Because honestly, the reason the British are prepared to let Ireland go is because it's just considered too much of a problem to keep it. It's not really worth the hassle. Especially as the way they let it go pretty much gives them all the bits they're really interested in Ireland anyway. And in this scenario, let's be honest, Ireland going off on its own, it's going off on its own into a far more fractured world, and with far more problems going on for it. It probably still does okay, though. The British are not going to want to lose a lot of troops fighting for it to keep and retain Ireland. Renan, that'll make 45,000-ton battleships. Really cheap after a while. As said, my theory is that there'll be 50,000 tons in standard. Will be the limitation for battleships. So it'll be 50,000 ton standard battleships. If we consider the N3s were about 49,300 tons in normal. The G3s were 49,200 tons in normal. Their designs roughly work out as about 55,000 tons in deep. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it's 50,000 tons standard. 18-inch guns and 15,000 tons will be the limitations. And that's gonna have fun. That's gonna have an impact. Can I say though, again, and this comes up quite regularly because I have this discussion over the G3s. The amount of times I get told by people who go, well, no, they were 16-inch guns. No, they were going to be 16.5-inch guns. I'm sorry, I have got the books which actually say it somewhere in here. I will track them down at some point and do another video on the G3s. Because 16.5-inch guns, not 16-inch guns. And the reason I'm so confident about this is because A, the British work in 1.5-inch jumps. And yes, they produce 16-inch guns for Nelson Rodney. But we know the design of those guns. We know they do work off of guns which are in development, but it was a 16.5-inch gun. And we also know the entire saga with the G3s, that they started off wanting to put 18-inch guns, and when they found they couldn't put 18-inch guns and get them for the tonnage they wanted and the size they wanted to fit within their infrastructure, they'd have had to rebuild new infrastructure to get what they want. Get what I wanted. They went down down the gun size, and the gun size was 16.5-inch. They were planning on skipping 16.5-inch guns to go straight to all 18-inch. They were skipping the generation which, honestly, if you consider World War One, if World War One hadn't happened, Queen Elizabeth, ours, probably some battle cruisers, and then you're looking at the next generation of guns, which the British were going to jump up to, probably 16.5-inch guns. maybe 18-inch guns, because let's be honest, Agincourt, I've told you before, I'm very suspicious was 18-inch guns, and that's a way to try and put a ceiling on and win the qualitative race rather than the quantitative race. And definitely the end freeze would have been 18-inch guns, and we know the British were developing 18-inch guns because they appear on Furious and in other scenarios. But the thing is, the other gun, the gun which is in between the 15-inch and the 18-inch is the 16.5-inch, and the British were working on that program as well. We've got different evidence supporting that, but that is the information. So the British weren't working on a 16-inch gun. That's the Americans. That's other powers. The British go 12, 13.5, 15, 16.5, 18. The Americans go 12, 14, 16. 18 probably. So the British make their lives a little bit more difficult by adding in an extra step, because that's what you've done. You consider 12, 14, 16, 18, that's 4 steps. The British it's 12, 13.5, 15, 16.5, 18, so it's an extra step to get to 18. Because the British were... how do I put this politely? The British were doing that for logistical reasons, but also for speed of construction reasons. You're growing by far less of an impact. Because the British were in both the qualitative race and the quantitative race, so for them 1.5 inch was the better route to go down. Run on the treaties. The means in the Pacific are going to be much louder with both an active IJ and Imperial Russian Naval fleet. Yeah. Again, this is going to change calculations all over the place. This is why I've said I'm not going further than basically the Washington Naval Treaty. I haven't jumped to further forward than 1922-23. Because you honestly can't predict further forward than 1922-23. The world is going to change massively. Oh, I can see the USN's fleet problems being part of a different opponent in mind. They will probably still be looking at Japan, but they might well be looking at Russia and France as well. In fact, there is a very real scenario in this where I could see you ending up with an Anglo-American-Japanese alliance taking place. It all depends on how Russia starts to act. Let's put it this way. Let's say quite a lot of the high-ranking Germans flee to South America. And let's say then you do have a rebellion in the German territories. And supplies are found to be coming from South American nations. You know, from charters, in ships coming from down there, supplies are being smuggled in to support the troops. And Russia decides to send its fleets to go and impress on the South American nations that they should not get involved. How are Britain and America going to react to that? Because America... well, they have an entire doctrine based around the idea of no one else gets to play around in South America other than them. And the British have the reality that they don't allow anyone else to muck around in South America other than them. And they don't mind the Americans as well, but that's about it. That's not going to end well for the Russians. That's going to end up with them going, we've sailed our battle fleet in, and the British and Americans turning up going, hello, so, we hear you're here to be annoying. You see that? That is a Colorado class. You see that? That is whatever the Royal Navy builds after World War I is over. That could be a G3. Or some Queen Elizabeth class. Or who knows what's come. There is a very real scenario where a resurgent Russia, which feels like it's won World War I, even though, frankly, it won't have won World War I, but it survived, will be very, very much pushing its weight around. It could well be pushing its weight around in China as well, wanting to take over Chinese territory and get warm water ports in the Pacific, which could lead to fighting with Japan. China could find itself in a two-way fight, in a three-way fight, itself versus Japan and Russia. In that scenario, traditionally, the Chinese had other powers. They had Germany, they had other powers they went to for their support. Well, France won't support them because that's their ally. Britain's going to be looking at defending India, so it's probably going to be happy to get involved, but probably supporting Japan in this scenario because they're probably still keeping their alliance going. America, well, if they don't want to actually get involved themselves, they might actually decide to support Japan as well. But honestly, I was actually, wouldn't the US work on unplugging France and Russia and forming US, UK, France, and London rather than going Japan? That depends. How useful is France in a scenario? What does unplugging France from Russia to get you? And does unplugging France from Russia help? Are you going to be able to unplug France from Russia? How do you do it? Remember, these are two powers which have just sacrificed a huge amount of blood fighting alongside each other in the name of their alliance in World War I. Humongous amount of blood. Why? I was looking, also without France and Germany gone, UK doesn't have a land power to traditionally counterbalance Europe. I'm presuming Britain probably goes with Italy. That's the option for Britain. Let's be honest. Who's now going to be sitting in the middle between France and Russia in Europe? It's going to be Italy. And the thing you're presuming also, Abzuski, with the idea of US is, remember, is very much isolationist at this moment. They're not going to, whilst they do seek to break up the Anglo-Japanese alliance, there is in some ways that works in Britain's favour, and Britain's prepared to break it up because that works for the treaty system. So it's not so much that America seeks to break it up and succeeds. It works for Britain to be able to go to Japan, well, as part of the treaty, we have to break our alliance because that's had to get this treaty through. So it's not our fault, it's America's. The treaty doesn't go through. A, Britain's not breaking up its alliance with Japan, and B, you're probably looking at a scenario of an alliance with Italy as well. In which case, America's probably slotting itself into the British alliance, because their options are to go with the Franco-Russian alliance, which they might do, there's a chance. But if Russia's sending their ships to South America, they won't. Or they slot into the Anglo alliance. The Anglo-led alliance would be Italy, Japan, and Britain. Which is interesting enough because, as I told you before, the qualitative race for dreadnoughts, the dreadnought qualitative race, is Britain, America, Italy, and Japan. That's the qualitative race. With honourable mention going to Austria-Hungary. And let's be honest again, what's Italy going to finish off in this round? They're probably going to be finishing off the Francisco Caracolas, which are going to really muck up the French position in the Mediterranean. And let's be honest, are also going to be an advantage against any of the existing Russian dreadnoughts. Bonus. So lots of discussions going about Spain. Spain is fundamentally weak. Remember, the Spanish-American War took advantage of Spain, and Spain is still not in much of a better position. Spain has still got a lot of issues going on. Italy is a far more sensible, a far more strong, coherent ally for Britain to go with than Spain. If there is no, and remember again, with Spain, the dictatorship comes a lot later. And as I said, you might not like Il Duce, But the thing is, he becomes a viable option for the British. I was asking, the thing is, they're sitting right in the middle. Again, if we go to this thing, yes, you're right, they are kind of landlocked and all these things, but they are still in the middle. And the thing is, with their armies, with the backing up of the Royal Navy, etc., what could they do with them? And I wouldn't also be surprised if the British do some alliances with the Scandinavians. But the thing is, you're looking for Britain to have a traditional land power as their ally. They traditionally do have a land power that they use in wartime, but they rarely have a formal alliance with them. They rarely do. They had a formal alliance with Japan. They didn't have an peacetime alliance with any of the others. So, in a wartime scenario, they'd be looking for an ally. And Britain was probably going to be playing around with the German states just as much as Russia and France are. In fact, probably more so. Ron, you might still get a naval treaty under that paradigm, but a cooperative development treaty between US, UK, Italy, and Japan. Potentially. See, Clarke, France is bankrupt at the end of World War I as UK is at the end of World War II for slightly different reasons. Yeah. So, Penguins, and wouldn't a resurgent Imperial Russian Navy add political weight to the Japanese Navy? Which would add a lot more changes, increasing the threat to the Philippines and Dutch possessions in the Far East. Oh, yes, it would do. And it would also... It would change the internal Japanese politics, because Russia, the traditional enemy, is there. So actually, you might... It's going to sound strange. With a resurgent Russia, there is a chance you have a better ground for building a friendship between America and Japan, because whilst America is the original enemy, Russia is the major enemy. Got it. El Ducky isn't. Well, yes, Il Duce isn't as strong in Italy as people think. As I've discussed on this channel several times. But the thing is, Italy itself is quite a good ally. Il Duce is a bit of a but you know, Italy itself is a fairly good ally. Well, again, Stafford. I don't know if the British would hand over ships to Portugal, because I don't know if Portugal will support them. But again, there's, as I've said, in this scenario, I don't see a treaty coming which actually limits numbers. I see a treaty coming which limits you're allowed to have ships which no more than 50,000 tons, which don't have anything bigger than 18 inch. It could be interesting. Britain might get back a certain island off the coast of Germany under this scenario. Britain might actually take the islands back. And again, this is going to be an interesting one, but it's going to be a case of if Russia is building ships, if France is building ships, if everyone's still building ships, then the British are just going to keep building ships as well as the Americans and the Japanese. Interesting thing is going to be if you do get an alliance between Italy, Japan, Britain, and America, or even between just America, Japan, and Britain. Does that lead to Japan not going bankrupt with its naval procurement? Because do they feel they need to build as much? Or rather, do the British and the Americans work very hard to make sure Japanese trade and economics are strong enough to support their fleet? Because it's in their self-interest for it to be so. The big point, he says as he scratches his nose, is that you are going to see the post-World War I generation of ships definitely built. No worries, Stafford. I presumed you'd missed that, and that's why I answered it the way I did. It's... honestly, you cannot overemphasize how much it changes things. Carriers are going to be interesting. So whilst the RM will have Furious, the Lexingtons will be complete as planned as an aggressive Imperial Russia Navy with Ismails might be a factor. And well, yeah, the thing is, you might actually have the carrier construction follow on more from Hermes. Think about that again as a thing. The carriers might actually be built from scratch. The first, yes, Furious possibly still gets converted. I don't know. Honestly, again, without the treaty requiring conversion, the British might build from scratch, because the British do realise building a carrier from scratch is going to be better than building something which is a conversion. I agree. We hate character limits. This is why I like doing the Discord chat afterwards. And I will be doing the Discord chat this evening. So there will be, if you go to the link down below, there will be a Discord chat this evening after the live. And the recorded video to come out tomorrow is the Glenn class landing ship infantries from World War II. And of course the Saturday video coming up is the Tillman one, I think. I think that's going to be, yes, last week's live. Senator Tillman lived. And, yeah. Hope you enjoyed that. And I will, of course, be live on Twitch on Sunday morning-ish time. Sunday lunchtime time. And then live, yeah, with Brew Ships in the afternoon. Evening time. Furious is already under conversion, yes, but she's being used as a testbed conversion. You also have to consider Furious. Furious is basically the thing they keep playing around with, because until they build something, they're not really sure what they want, so they're testing around with her. But the thing is, they don't really like it. It works for them to play around with her, but they're also at the same time building Hermes. They're also doing Eagle. And if you've done Eagle, which is basically a battleship converted almost from when it's under construction. Hermes, which is built from scratch as a carrier, has some inefficiencies in it, but it's mostly what they've added in. And you've got Furious, which you're testing out. Do you then go Courageous, Glorious, or do you just go build your own? And I'll be putting up the next load of patron suggestions on... The next load of patron suggestions will go live on Sunday. And they will be live till the 25th. And then the patron vote will go live on the 25th. And that'll be live till the 3rd of March. Goodness gracious me, we're already in March. How does the year go? Seriously. And this is all going to sound strange because there are various different moving parts going on. But with shipshape, I've been currently sitting there today working out the fact that A, we can go and see the big German 16-inch guns if we go to Harstad, which is 90 minutes drive from Narvik. So I'm going to need to find a driver when we're in Narvik. But also, either that or rent a car. But the trouble is most of the cars seem to be rented at the airport, which is already 45 minutes outside of Narvik. And we're going to be arriving in Narvik by train. Because we're coming from Stockholm. And the overnight train makes far more sense than going by plane, because the planes to go between Stockholm and Narvik are interesting. Honestly, if you've got no limitation on the... Remember, the big problem for the British is always building enough carriers, so that's why they go for smaller carriers like Ark Royal, like Illustrious. The whole thing, if we go to the Admiral Madden's suggestion, As I've said before, I could see the Royal Navy going with two style carriers, a large one and a small one. And they both would have armour to their level of their duties, but they would both be, have their air groups to their protective duties. But the thing is, you're probably dealing with a large carrier which would be about 30,000 tons, because, again, if you've got a treaty which is limiting capital ships to 50,000 tons in standard, there is no way carriers are being limited to 27,000 tons. You're talking at least 30 to 35,000 tons standard limit for a carrier. I would say probably 35. In which case, the British probably are building their carriers at 35,000 tons standard for their large carriers, and 17,500 tons for their light carriers. Because whilst you, as I said, the likely Washington Treaty, that if there is a Washington Treaty, it's going to be an individual ship treaty, i.e. this are limitations on this ship. You cannot give them more than 18-inch guns. You cannot build ships which are more than this tonnage, da-da-da-da-da. Sort of thing. Works, but I don't think you have a numbers treaty, because I don't think France is going to agree to parity with this power and da-da-da-da-da. So the way you achieve those limitations is by just their limited infrastructure. So let's be honest, even if France is allowed to build as many as they like, they're not going to be able to afford it, and they don't have the infrastructure, and they can order it and they will get it in about 1940. It just doesn't matter. 50,000 tons are limitation for capital ships. That's based on G3s and N3s. There's going to be no the size limitation on cruisers. That's probably going to be about 20,000 tons, maybe less, but not much less. If carriers are limited to a maximum size of 35,000 tons, and capital ships are limited to 50,000 tons, then cruisers could be limited to 20,000 tons. That's the reality. I don't think you end up with 37,000 tons. 35,000 tons makes sense to my mind. And there's a reason for that, because when you're going through the tonnage limitations, the reason you go to 35,000 tons, not to 37 or anything like that, and jumping up by a full 10,000 tons, is because if you consider the capital ships are 15,000 tons heavier. And so you've pushed them up by 15,000 tons. You're not going to push carriers up by the same amount in this period, so it's going to be talked down. 27 to 35 is roughly 8,000 tons increase. And then if you go to cruisers, if they're 20,000 tons, that's a 10,000 ton increase. But it makes sense. It fits with what's going on in terms of the standard tonnage limitations. And let's be honest, the 35,000 tons in standard carrier is going to be brilliant. For this period, if you're building something which is 35,000 tons standard displacement as a carrier, you're talking about something which is, tonnage-wise, is an Ark Royal plus a Unicorn in many respects. You know, the carriers you're going to be dealing with at 35,000 standard ton displacement, they're going to be Maltas and Midways. And if you're able to build as many as you like, then what the British and the Americans can end up doing is basically launching a carrier a year and trying iterative development of their carriers, which is going to affect, again, having an aircraft production design. Because if you think about it, if you're building carriers which are 35,000 tons in standard, you're going to get twin-engined aircraft on them. Which could mean you are looking at carriers which have a strike range of 600 plus nautical miles quite quickly. That changes things. This is another reason why the point you get to, as I've often tried to discuss, at a certain point with alternate histories, You get to a point at which you are no longer being able to predict them because you're basing so many things on the assumptions you made, assumptions you made, that you can move so far from history, you don't have a reference point to fix it by. You are beyond the scope of your ability to navigate. Blackmaster, remember again, Washington Treaty doesn't place any limitations on ships below 10,000 tons. So if you have a 20,000 ton, if you have no tonnage cumulative limitations on them, and you're saying that carriers are allowed to be up to 35,000 tons, capital ships are allowed up to be up to 50,000 tons, and all ships below 20, all cruisers, etc., and other ships are allowed to be up to 20,000 tons. It's completely left up to the nation's devices what they do. All I can tell you is there will be some very, very big cruisers. Will they be 20,000 tons with an 8-inch gun limit? Maybe. Maybe. And they could be 20,000 tons with a 10-inch gun limit. There's also going to be a reality of what cruisers do the British decide to build in a world where Imperial Russia is still going to be around. Do they go with the Hawkins? Or do they go with the bit of the Hawkins as designed, the 7.5-inch guns? Or do they go with the Hawkins and the 9.2-inch gun designs? And please note, if you consider it, if we go back to it in history, goes 35,000 tons, which is an 8,000 ton limit. And they go down to 10,000 tons, which is 17,000 tons below the carriers. So it goes 27,000 tons. And they also have this nebulous conversion carrier, which can be, once you've add all things, can be 33,000 tons exactly. The thing is, you wouldn't have the conversion carrier. So actually, what you probably do is you take that tonnage limitation, and that was sort of figure 35,000 tons was always around. So if you're not going to go for 33, you go for 35. You're not going to go for 37,000 tons. Because again, think about how big that carrier would have to be 37,000 tons. That's beyond the scope of anyone's thought. You're going to go, especially in a treaty which is going to involve the Russians, etc., and all these powers being limited to tonnages, you're going to want to go for things which are as clearly defined as possible. If you're going 50,000 tons, then 35,000 tons, then 20,000 tons, those are all big numbers, but they are clearly defined and separated. There's a 15,000 tons differential between them. It gives you a lot of clear blue water between those things. But again, that's if a treaty actually gets agreed in any way, shape or form. You know, the Russians and Japanese might be at so much at each other's throats that no treaty gets agreed. Or the Russians might claim they're going to build a 20-inch gun battleship, so therefore it needs to be 20-inch guns limitation. At which point the British would look at them and go, "You in which nation's shipyards?" But you know, this is the scenario you're dealing with. It's a major change to world history. The fact that Stalin's going to be coming up to the London Naval Treaty in 1930 in next month's Patreon Alternate History question, that's going to be a massive change. It's actually more predictable because more of the players are going to be the same who are around, etc. But the thing is, again, the nation which suffers the most, which is going to suffer the most with the Soviets getting involved in the London Naval Treaty in 1930, without a doubt, any scenario work out, is Germany. Because any scenario where the Soviets build anything like a battleship in the 1930s before World War II begins, even a couple of them, and they probably could if they go home from the 1930 London Treaty and try and build something. It's not going to be great, but they're going to build something. Is not good for the Germans. The reaction of the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Finns is going to be even more fun for the Germans. But more importantly, for all that, if the Soviets are allowed to build a part of the treaty, well, remember the Japanese, the Americans, the Brits, the French, the Italians are all part of the treaty. Where does the Soviet Union fit? And how does it affect? Because what it might have to be allowed, okay, to get the Soviet Union through, and I'm working through, still trying to work out whether this is a case in the London Treaty where the Soviets are part of it, is that the British and the Americans have to go up to 20 capital ships. So Japan is allowed to, of course, go up to roughly 3/5 of them. So they're able to go up to 12 capital ships. The Soviet Union is allowed 12 capital ships. And if we consider the French and the Italians, roughly 2.2, well, they end up with 9 each. Or 8.5, depending on your perspective. And that can change a lot of things. We're gonna, if Russia throws around the idea of a 20-inch gun, then the Admiralty will have to deal with a rabid Fisher trying to get him comparable built. You can say it again 3 times on Sundays. Same plot. I can see Stalin being more pragmatic than Nicholas Evarts. Oh yes, Stalin would come in demanding equivalency with Britain and America, settle for equivalency with Japan. But the trouble is, Japan won't accept for equivalency on its existing strategy with Russia. And let's put it this way: if you have that happen, what you could for the British and the Americans, again thinking about trying to recover from the Wall Street crash and all those scenarios. Well, if Britain and America are able to order 5 battleships off the get-go in early 1930s, that's good for them. What do the British order, though? This is the thing. If the British order them before Chatfield becomes First Sea Lord, so if the British order them, and he is First Sea Lord, let's see, he's before his time as Ministry of Coordination and Defence. 33. If they're ordered before he becomes First Sea Lord, so if they're ordered while that wonderful person, Sir Frederick Field, who I have a book written by somewhere, and books written about, is First Sea Lord, or even better, while Charles Madden. Remember Charles Madden, the guy who wanted oodles and oodles of carriers in the 1920s, and basically was going, I want 40-odd carriers. If either of them are First Sea Lord when the order comes through, it's gonna be 16-inch guns on the battleships. In which case, the King George V's are gonna be built. They're gonna be 16-inch gunships. Same timeline as the King George V's are built are gonna be your next batch of 5. You're not dropping down to 14-inch guns. They're gonna be 16-inch guns that get shipped again. The British could end up entering World War II, and if you think about it, what's the big thing that holds up the King George V's production? It's the it's the armour, it's all the things. Well, if you've actually had this construction take place in the 1930s, you'll have the growth of armour, etc., manufacture and rebuilding of that in the 1930s. And remember, there's more of it still around at that point in the early 1930s because Nelson and Rodney's construction, and it hasn't been quite for its nadir. Well, that means you could have likely, you could have had 10 Not a 10, 9, 16-inch gun, 28 knot plus fast battleships in service by the time World War II begins. And let's be honest, Germany's infrastructure's not getting better. They've now got to deal with maybe 2 to 3 Russian battleships, because if they're going to be finished anywhere, it's going to be the Baltic, which is the only place where they have access to actually decent shipyards. So they're going to have those there. They're going to build, as traditionally, they can't build much any more than they do historically because of their infrastructure limitations. And then on the other side, they've got someone who's got, they've got Britain having 10 of these new fast battleships. It's a nightmare for Germany. Germany's in the worst situation of anyone. For Japan, it might stop them actually building Yamato and Musashi, because they'd be building probably building conventional battleships in the 1930s. And you know, it just changes things. Palmer's might not be closed. It's a possibility. It probably would. It could well be a fast Nelson type. Jacob, would a random not related to the current topic thought, would a hull of modern US carriers make for a good battlecruiser hull? They're designed for... You'd have to do some modifications, but they could. I'm not sure if you're going to make it a good hull, but they'd certainly make a decent hull. Take care, Sailing Penguins. Jacob, does the car rental not have a deputy office near a big train station? I'm hoping they do. Stefan, if they build without limits, would the RN have tried for a higher 115, 130 aircraft, or would they retain the smaller wings? Well, again, Stafford, think about it. If you can build a ship of up to 35,000 tons, and you can build as many of them as you like, the reason the British have the smaller wings is because they have to pick. If they're going to get 6 carriers in 135,000 tons, they're limited to 22, 23,000 tons. They can either get armour or they can get an air wing. They can either get Illustrious or they can get an Ark Royal. They can't get both on that tonnage. But on 35,000 tons, you can get both. Would they be necessarily as big as their American counterparts in terms of their air wings? No, probably the Americans have larger air wings because the British are going to have more armour. But the thing is, the British air wing is probably still going to be 90 plus aircraft. 90 to 100 aircraft, it's going to be fine. So you've got the Iron's 45 carrier fleet. That's the thing. The entire under this scenario, the Imperial Russia scenario, if there's no limitation on number of ships they can build, then the British could be considered the carrier fleet, because with people like Madden in charge at the points they're in charge of, people who really wanted a lot of aircraft carriers, oh my lord. Sorry, I tried to chuck the iron brew down my throat. If the treaty is 50,000 tons for battleships, what are the size of cruisers? As said, I reckon about 20,000 tons would be the limit for any ships which are not capital ships or carriers. Who succeeds Nicholas II? Probably his son? Let's be honest. His, Alexei Nikolaev, born 1904, is likely to be his successor. So, the young man who dies at 13. It's unlikely to be Dragout Michael. There's always a possibility that Alexei dies due to his haemophilia. But yeah, it's an interesting scenario. It is a interesting scenario. That was one good thing about the scenario, no burn carry. We'd almost made it through this entire video without any mentioning of the burn. Why? Why? Blackburn Maximus, did you have to bring it up? Why? British infrastructure is in a much better place to build them. Yeah. Nicest way. British infrastructure barely declines in this period. Ethan, did the Fleet Air Fighters, did they ever have the same formation shooting and Vic formation as Royal Air Force? Very rarely, and the reason for that is often because of the way they maintain their combat air patrols. So you would often usually have them split up in pairs rather than in a solid group, because you have to remember the focus for the Fleet Air Army in air defense, especially for the fighters, was to break up enemy air attacks. So the Vic-3 is lovely, but it gives you a limited position. When you've got a limited number of aircraft, it can absorb more. It absorbs more aircraft because it requires 3 or more. So I don't think so. I think they stuck mainly with the pairs. Stafford does again. You're saying USN level of AA as well. In 1939, the British have the heaviest amount of air defense on any carrier, on any ship. In sort of some destroyers, they have more AA than other nations do. The Americans watch what's happening in war and go, "We're upping ours," and then they get into war and they go for an explosion of AA. This is the thing: is all the nations go through that, depending on their industrial capacity and their ability to do that. So that's more about that's a moot point. Anyways, well, Cody, let's put it this way: in this Washington Treaty, nothing will be restricted. In that you have a limitation of you can build a carrier to a maximum 35,000 tons, you can build a capital ship to a maximum 50,000 tons, you can build anything else to a maximum 20,000 tons. But there's no cumulative limitations anyway, so there's no cumulative. This is not the Washington Treaty of, because basically the point that's been made, and I would agree, and is the thing, is the only way you could get a Washington Treaty through is if you delete the cumulative tonnage limitations, get rid of them completely. You have individual ship types restrictions. You do not have cumulative restrictions. Blackmore's succession crisis of the Russians as their first internal conflict. You could well have that because, let's be honest, there are the daughters. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. And, as I understand it, Olga was not exactly stupid. And she was pretty capable. So yeah, I'd be if I was various personnel in Russia, considering the history of Catherine the Great, etc. I would have been slightly worried about Olga. I would have been. She's very capable. There's also the second sister. In fact, all the sisters are fairly capable. I would be keeping my eye on all of them, and wondering which one was going to slip me a bit of something in my tea next. But I honestly think Finland's going to blow before there's a succession crisis. I would say the big gun submarines, again, they are in a way a product of treaty, but also I think they get even weaker by treaty, because remember, as we discussed the other week when I was talking about them, there are limitations in terms of their range of fire. If your standard cruiser wandering around the world is displacing 20,000 tons and 9.2-inch guns, then frankly, Lord help a submarine on the surface. In fact, and then you've got your destroyers, etc. In a world where your cruisers are 20,000 tons, your light cruisers are probably going to be 12 to 15,000 tons. Your heavy cruisers about 20,000 tons, 18 to 20,000 tons. Your destroyers could well be 3 to 4,000 tons. In which case, the likelihood of, well, eventually end up there, the likelihood of your big gun submarine actually being able to fight on the surface with anything goes down dramatically. At 13, he'd be a figurehead in 1918, yes, but the trouble is, I don't think Nicholas dies anytime soon. Nicholas is not that old. And I haven't killed him off in this video. I haven't. Basically, he survived. So, you know, he dies in 1918 at the age of 50. In the nicest way, Russia could well be saddled with him in a leadership position for another 20 years. Getting worse every year. Anyway, so it's roughly been 2.5 hours. I'm going to have a break now, and then I'm going to appear on Discord. So, what have we got coming up? Well, next week we have the USN Aircraft Squadron System officially. That's if the book arrives. The book I've asked for, I have ordered, which is a very good history of USN Aircraft Carrier Squadrons, is supposed to arrive tomorrow. He says it's supposed to arrive tomorrow because it was supposed to arrive Tuesday, and they've moved back the date of arrival again for the 4th time. If it doesn't arrive tomorrow, I'm going to be swapping it around with HMS Furious, and Furious is going to be on the 20th, and the Aircraft Squadron System is going to be on the 27th. The Four Sisters have a history of working together. The Four Sisters are a maximum of 20 years old at this point. And they're mostly younger. So, I think... let's see. In 1918, Olga is 22. Tatiana is 21. Maria is 19 in 1918. Anastasia is 17. They are quite possibly going to work together. But also they are dealing with a Russian system. They're also, it is well known, they're all quite loyal to their brother as well. Maria was basically a teenager, Blackburn Maximus. Don't take this the wrong way, but speaking as someone who's spent his life around a lot, thanks to being the only boy in 40 cousins, and spent a lot of time around teenage girls, it's very easy for a teenage girl to get a reputation for having mood swings. In fact, it's quite easy for a teenage boy to get a reputation for having mood swings. Let's be honest. I'm not going to base any long-term personality analysis on people's performance of what they get up to and what are rumored to be about them in their teenage years, especially as what you're dealing with, especially when it comes to the Rosaris royal family, are a lot of things which were accentuated to justify killing them. Okay? There are a lot of rumors which are put out, and a lot of things which are put out to justify killing them. And those things are repeated and repeated and repeated. Now, there's a debate with Maria whether it was her or Anastasia who was with Alexei when he died, and it was with him. We're not quite sure which of the bodies it was, whether it was her or Anastasia who was staying with Alexei and trying to protect him. We don't know. So no, I'm not getting into a whole thing of writing off those sort of things about teenage girls, etc., which were mostly second-hand evidence from people who either actively disliked them or actively sought to discredit them, to blame them for all their own blunders. No. I am. There are many historians who like to, I don't know, project the modern world onto the past. And if that's what they want to do, that's what they want to do. But that's not me. And it's the same with, I'm not going to let someone get attacked when they were a teenager. Again, she's a teenager. Again, those reports mostly come second-hand. And again, there are all sorts of reputations you have when you're a teenager. Take care, Just Funk. Thank you, Drew Petrington. Thank you, Paul Amos. Thank you, John Shea. DG40. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stafford. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Black Masters. Thank you, Rion. Thank you, Tim O'Neill. Thank you, David Goulding. Thank you, Carmen Gosbeck. Thank you, Runon. Thank you, Steve Clarke. Thank you, Leslie Mitchell. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, everyone who's been here. IO2 and all the others. Faulkner, no. New Echoey 4472. Night 6831. Cody Derson. Jacob W5570. Sen Penguins. Make sure I get CM McDevitt. Thank you. Thank you, Albazaski. Thank you, Michael Cooch. Thank you. That's as far as it will let me go up. So thank you, Dan. Dan Free. I don't know Dan was on here. And Paul. And Jack Ryan. I know they were on here because I remember chatting them at the beginning. And second, seriously, there are so many reasons to check and verify sources. But again, let's put it this way. One of the least accurate sources you can ever find on someone who's a teenager is often their parents. Because I can give an example not far away from me. They're not relative to me, but they're family I know quite well because they're quite close to us. Where if you were asking for my assessment of the children and their attributes and what they're going to be and how they're doing, it'd be very different than their parents' assessment, because there is an absolute clash of personalities between the mother and the eldest daughter. An absolute clash of personalities. A massive one. And so, if you're listening to the parents, the daughter is a very argumentative, very forthright person. But when you talk to the daughter differently, you're sort of going, you're not. And I've actually taught them, and they were fine. And so I sort of thought, well, what is it? And It's literally just a class of personalities. Just because your relatives are related by blood doesn't mean you're going to get along. So, yeah. Again, I would say that a lot of sources which are maintained about them come through a filter of many years of communist Soviet filtration, which was very, very interesting. See you on Discord. See you on Discord later. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and hope you enjoyed.